On the night of April 14, 1912, Titanic sailed through calm waters with more than 2,200 people on board, convinced they were on one of the safest ships in the world. In lounges, cabins, and corridors, life went on as usual, while ice warnings piled up in the wireless room. Within minutes, lookouts would spot something in the dark that would change everything. Before we rebuild, step by step, what each passenger was doing in that final hour, hit subscribe and stay with us until the end of this investigation. On the night of April 14, 1912, Titanic was crossing the North Atlantic on her way to New York, keeping up high speed in an area known for heavy ice. Conditions at sea were unusual, a surface with almost no waves and a very clear sky with countless visible stars. Records show there were more than 2,200 people on board, between passengers and crew, spread across 3 very distinct classes. On the bridge, officers watched course and speed, trusting in the ship's engineering. Meanwhile, the engines ran at a steady pace to keep the giant moving through the night. In first class, the last hour before impact was all about routine and comfort. Dinner was already over and many passengers were leaving lounges, smoking rooms and social spaces. Accounts talk about long conversations, card games and informal gatherings that went on almost until midnight. Stewards picked up glasses, straightened chairs and turned off lights in empty rooms. For most of these people, it was just another night on board a modern ocean liner, with no sense of any immediate danger. In second class, the last hour before the collision moved at a quieter pace. Many passengers used the writing tables to record their impressions of the voyage on Titanic letterhead. Others were packing luggage and organizing belongings, getting ready to arrive in the United States in the days ahead. Accounts mention simple activities, reading, short walks on deck, and low-key conversations in shared areas. The environment was comfortable, with good finishes and attentive service, but without first-class luxury. For these passengers, the ship was a major step up in comfort for their kind of travel, and nothing that night pointed to any sudden break in the routine. In third class, the last hour before the collision was marked by simple routines and crowded spaces. Families shared cabins and dormitory-style rooms, organizing children, clothing, and small personal items for the night. Many of these passengers were immigrants bound for the United States, carrying little baggage and huge expectations. Narrow corridors stayed busy, with people heading to the restroom, getting water, or fixing improvised beds. Evidence suggests that in this part of the ship, the noise of the engines was louder and the discomfort greater, yet the dominant feeling was still normality. For many of these people, Titanic was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to change their future. Behind the scenes on Titanic, the last hour before the collision was filled with end-of-shift work. Stewards and cabin staff collected dishes, straightened furniture, and checked that lounges and passageways were in order. In pantries and galleys, part of the crew stored utensils, shut cabinets, and wrote down needs for the next day. These workers were rarely seen in the fancy areas, but they were essential to keeping service standards high. For them, the night followed a familiar pattern: finish cleaning, check lists, and leave everything ready for the morning, with no sign that anything out of the ordinary was coming. In the lowest parts of Titanic, the last hour before the collision was defined by hard, continuous work. Firemen and boiler crews fed coal into the furnaces to keep the ship's speed up. The environment was hot, noisy, and completely cut off from any view of sea or sky. Engineers watched gauges, valves, and the performance of the engines, taking orders passed down from the bridge. Reports and technical records show that pressure and revolutions were kept high throughout that night. For most of these men, time was measured only by the clocks below decks and the rhythm of their shifts, not by any change in the world outside. In Titanic's wireless room, the last hour before the collision was packed with a heavy flow of private passenger messages. The operators were trying to clear a backlog of traffic caused by an earlier equipment failure. Mixed in with those messages came warnings from other ships about ice fields and icebergs ahead on Titanic's route. Some of those warnings were passed on to the bridge, while others got buried in the routine of wireless work. Records show that commercial traffic had priority, which added to the operator's overload. In that small room, with headphones on and signals coming in non-stop, the main feeling was urgent work, not imminent danger to the ship. On the bridge, the last hour before the collision was marked by routine watchkeeping, with no drastic changes in course or speed. Officers monitored the instruments, confirmed the ship's position, and kept the engine revolutions high. Several ice warnings had already come in during the day, and some of them were known on the bridge. Even so, the decision was to press on at high speed through the ice zone, trusting in the ship's ability to maneuver and the strength of her hull. The calm sea and clear sky reinforced a sense of safety, despite the risk information for the area. As the night went on, the temperature on deck dropped sharply. Passengers who stepped outside to walk reported a much deeper cold than on earlier nights of the voyage. The sea stayed strangely calm, with almost no visible swell, which made it harder to spot obstacles by watching the way waves broke. The lookouts and some officers noticed this combination of flat sea, very clear sky, and icy air as typical of waters where drifting ice was nearby. Even so, for most people on board, these were just normal variations in North Atlantic weather, with no clear sign of immediate danger. As the clock moved toward midnight, most of the ship was settling into a nighttime routine. Clocks in lounges, corridors, and service areas all showed the same hour, but in each class, the end of the day looked different. Some passengers were still walking the decks. Others were already turning out the lights in their cabins. On the bridge, course and speed stayed steady. In the engine room, work did not stop. On board, almost no one directly connected the falling temperature and calm sea with the ice warnings that had been received. To understand what each group was doing, minute by minute, from the bridge down to third class, we follow this timeline all the way to the moment the warning finally reaches the lookouts and the crew. High up in the foremast, the lookouts worked under conditions very different from those of the passengers. With no binoculars available, they relied only on their own eyes to pick out any obstacle in the dark. The cold was brutal, with wind chill well below freezing because of the constant wind. From up there, they could see partly empty decks, a few lights still on and what looked like a flat, smooth sea ahead. Later testimonies note that the lack of waves breaking at the base of possible icebergs made them harder to see. Even so, the routine followed a familiar pattern. Eyes fixed on the horizon, bell ready to ring, and the internal phone within reach for immediate contact with the bridge. In the final minutes before the iceberg was sighted, nothing inside the ship suggested a sudden change. Speed was still high, and the engine revolutions remained steady. Up above, the lookouts stayed focused on the dark horizon, fighting the cold and the difficulty of seeing contrasts on a moonless sea. The blend of flat water, very low temperatures, and earlier ice warnings was a known pattern for seasoned navigators. For most people on board, though, Titanic was just a huge ship on a normal crossing, with no hint that the routine was about to be shattered. In a matter of seconds, the quiet routine in the crow's nest turns into the critical point of the voyage. The lookouts notice a subtle change on the horizon, a pale mass with no movement of its own, rising directly in the ship's path. In conditions of flat sea and a moonless sky, a shape like that is hard to make out until it is very close. Once they recognize ice ahead, the lookouts follow procedure. They ring the bell and call the bridge on the internal phone. From that moment on, every second between the warning, the officer's assessment and the engine's response becomes crucial in determining how much damage Titanic will suffer. After the lookout's warning, the bridge reacts within seconds. Historical accounts say the iceberg was reported dead ahead, pushing the officer of the watch to order an immediate change of course and to work the engine telegraph. The order sent down to the engine room called for a sharp reduction in speed and an attempt to reverse the propellers. At the same time, the helm was put over to try to avoid a side impact with the ice. The gap between the bell in the crow's nest and the first orders on the bridge was very short. Even so, the distance to the iceberg was small for a ship the size of Titanic, and that limited how much she could maneuver. While the bridge and the engine room reacted to the iceberg warning, the routine in first class changed very little at first. Passengers were finishing getting ready for bed, putting away personal items, taking off jewelry and folding clothes. Some were still moving through the corridors, walking back from public rooms to their cabins. Survivor testimony says many of them felt, at most, a faint shudder or a slight change in the sound of the engines, without understanding the cause in that moment. For this group, the minutes around the collision felt like part of a normal night at sea until clearer signs began to appear. In second class, the period when the ship was maneuvering felt like a simple continuation of the regular nighttime routine. Passengers put away books, closed suitcases, and adjusted their cabins to sleep. Some walked the corridors on their way to their rooms, others still passed quickly through common areas. Testimony suggests that few people noticed anything different in the ship's behavior at that time, beyond small vibrations that could easily be mistaken for normal engine adjustments. The minutes when Titanic tried to steer away from the iceberg were not perceived as a critical event, but as part of the technical operation that most people never saw. In third class, the ship's maneuver almost went unnoticed. Most families were already in bed in crowded dormitories, with children sharing bunks and adults squeezed into nearby berths. Engine noise and hull vibration were stronger in this part of the ship, making it hard to sense small changes in how the vessel was running. Some passengers were still in the corridors, going to the restroom or fixing blankets. Later accounts say that for many of them, the moment of impact felt like nothing more than a small jolt or muffled noise, easy to confuse with the normal motion of a working ship. In service corridors and other internal areas used by the crew, changes in the ship's behavior were easier to pick up. Stewards, waiters, and galley staff heard sounds that were not part of the usual background. A long scraping along the hull and a brief shift in the engine's rhythm. Some stopped what they were doing for a few seconds, trying to figure out where the noise came from. Then many went back to their tasks, waiting for formal instructions. The ship's hierarchy meant these crew members expected orders from officers instead of acting on their own. At that point, the crew's sense that something was wrong was still fragmented and limited to a few spots. Right after the orders from the bridge, the engine room had to respond within seconds. The internal telegraph called for reduction and reversal, forcing quick adjustments to valves, coal feed, and shaft revolutions. Technical reports show there was an attempt to slow the ship and soften the impact. Shortly after that, in compartments further forward, some crew members noticed water coming in, at first in controlled amounts, but enough to show the hull had been breached. Communication between these areas followed the internal chain of command, with engineers assessing the situation and passing information up to the officers. At that moment, the main focus was still to understand how big the damage was, not whether the ship herself might be lost. Survivor accounts describe the collision with the iceberg in very different ways. Some passengers talk about a gentle bump, as if the ship had run over something or braked softly. Others remember a low sound, like metal scraping in the distance. Some people hardly noticed anything at all and only learned of the impact when crew members told them. A few recall a brief silence in the engines, followed by the feeling that the ship was slowing down. These testimonies help us see that for most passengers, the moment of impact was not instantly recognized as something life-changing. After the collision, the first visible signs for passengers came from how the crew behaved. Some stewards and pursers began moving faster along the corridors, checking doors and common areas. Within a few minutes, curious passengers started asking questions on their own, opening cabin doors or stepping out on deck to see what was happening. The crew's first instructions were to keep calm and look for information from the officers. At this stage, there was no general emergency announcement, and many answers were still vague. The ship only seemed to have slowed down, which helped create the impression that everything was under control. While water started to enter forward compartments, much of life on board still unfolded in bright, comfortable surroundings. In first and second class, cabins, lounges, and corridors continued to project an image of safety, backed by confidence in the ship's size and reputation. Below the waterline, engineers and seamen tracked the spread of flooding, closing watertight doors and starting pumps to fight the inflow. The gap between what passengers could see and what the technical crew was witnessing was huge. That information imbalance explains why so many people took a long time to grasp how serious the situation already was in the first few dozen minutes after the collision. As water pushed deeper into the forward compartments, engineers and officers began piecing together the full picture of the damage. Water level readings, direct inspection, and pump performance helped create the first real assessment. Those findings moved up the chain of command to the bridge and then to the captain. At the same time, some stewards and pursers already sensed that this was more than a simple stop or routine incident. Short conversations in corridors and lounges started rumors circulating among passengers who were still awake. Even so, most people on board still had no idea that the ship was in serious trouble. After that first damage assessment, the crew quietly began telling some passengers to put on life jackets and head to the boat decks. The first instructions were given mainly in first and second class areas, in a calm tone, with no calls for panic. Many passengers took the request as a precaution or drill, not as a sign of imminent danger. In third class, information moved more slowly, with groups held at stairways and corridor doors waiting for permission to pass. That mismatch in instructions marks the first minutes when the apparent routine of the last hour starts to unravel, still in a subtle way. As flooding increased, the decision to ready the lifeboats was put into action. Officers and seamen began removing covers, checking lines, and testing the davits. On the bridge and in the wireless room, the change in posture also became clear. Distress calls started going out to other ships in the area. Even then, many passengers still saw the activity on deck as a precautionary measure. The contrast between the technical language of the distress signals and the relatively calm look of the decks helps explain why the sense of real danger took time to spread through the ship. In the final minutes of this first phase after the collision, Titanic presents two different realities at once. On the upper decks, first and second class passengers, already wearing life jackets, wait near the boats under the officer's guidance, still believing this is just a temporary safety measure. In the lower compartments and in third class, water moves in unevenly, cutting off routes and shrinking the options to get out. Most people on board still do not grasp that the damage cannot be undone. When these seemingly controlled routines are broken by more direct orders and by the ship's increasing list, the passengers' final hour of normal life will be gone for good.